Welcome everyone, wherever you may be, whether it be in Texas or Arizona or other parts of the United States or beyond. We certainly hope that you will enjoy the presentation today. Before we turn to our distinguished speaker for the day, let me just say a couple of things about the Center for Latinos in American Politics Research, of which I, Rodney Hero, am the director. We have a whole variety of activities that animate our efforts and our goals of advancing Latino politics research in the United States. Let me just very quickly mention a couple of things. Just this past week, we co-hosted and supported a conference that focused on interest groups and legislatures with a focus on institutions and legislatures and interest groups. It was called the COP conference, KOPF conference. We are also currently involved and in fact are already talking about a midterm survey that we have been involved with Univision and others. And the associate director of the center, Francisco Pedraza, was on a webinar just a couple of days ago speaking with individuals from Univision, Jorge Ramos specifically, as well as a Democratic pollster and a Republican pollster, examining a variety of questions of Latinos' attitudes, voting, issue preferences and concerns and so on, with a focus on Arizona, but he spoke much beyond that as well. So, please be aware that that webinar is out there and the survey data some of them are available. So if you're interested in pursuing that, let us know and we'd be happy to make it available to you. In fact, I believe it's now being sent out by our coordinator, Xenia Weatherall, with that information. So please take a look at it. It's very interesting and we very much welcome your thoughts, ideas, and the like, because we want to be a source of lots of important and interesting information about the Latino population in the United States generally, as well as Arizona in particular. One other thing, we will also be hosting a conference January 20th of 2023. It's the so-called PREAT conference, the Politics of Race, Immigration, and Ethnicity Consortium, again, January 20th of 2023. So be looking for information about that as well. We have a variety of presentation by young scholars in particular, but most significantly, a variety of interesting and important questions that are very central to understanding race, ethnicity in American politics. So I know I've mentioned several things very quickly and so on, but please explore these further and pursue them because we very much would like and welcome your interest and participation. All right, let's go ahead and turn then to our distinguished speaker for the day. We're very fortunate to have with us Jeronimo Cortina, who is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and the director of the Faculty Research Initiatives at the University of Houston's Population Health. He earned his PhD at Columbia University in political science, where he previously earned a master's degree in public administration and public policy from Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. He specializes in Latino politics, survey research, geographic information systems, and immigration. He's a very active, prolific scholar. He's the author of numerous academic journals, books, and edited volumes. And he's actually the co-host of Party Politics, which is a podcast on Houston Public Media, and the political analyst for Telemundo Houston and its affiliates, Texas affiliates. Today, he's going to make his presentation. I hope I'm not being redundant here, Jeronimo, but it's called Location, 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 the Role of Geography on Public Opinion and Political Participation. So we're very fortunate and pleased to have Jeronimo with us. So he will now begin presenting, and later Professor Pedraza will be involved in handling the question and answer period. Okay, Jeronimo, take over. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you very much, Rodney, and thank you to the Center for inviting me to you, and obviously to your new associate director, Dr. Pedraza, and also thank you to Xenia for all the back and forward of dealing with different bureaucracies between Texas and Arizona. That is always very interesting to see how other universities work in terms of paperwork, and we're very similar, unfortunately. But I'm very excited to be here to talking to you all about these new research projects that I'm working on. Let me just start sharing my slides. Chat, share screen. Okay. So today, what I want to talk about is something that is very interesting from, I guess, theoretical point of view, but also methodologically speaking, is something interesting about how we think about geography, how we think about where we are, and how we think about distance. So the research questions that I'm doing in this research, this is a book manuscript that I'm working on. Hopefully it's going to be soon done by the end of this year, more or less. It's about why people react differently to similar events, with the only caveat that one happens far away from us while other happens very close to us. So think about, in terms of social media, in terms of the 24/7 news cycle, so on and so forth, right? That to a certain extent that makes us very close to an event. But even though that social media or news, and we can know what's going on, for example, in the Ukraine, just by Googling it or going to Fox News or CNN or MSNBC, we don't get to experience, right, the here and now. We don't get to experience the context. We don't get to experience how that is going to transform our behaviors and to transform our opinions about a thing, about a political phenomena, or about anything to that matter. So these seems to be perhaps, a kind of obvious research question, right? Especially in these 24/7 news cycles. However, the way that I'm conceptualizing, especially the role of distance, geographic distance, and the role of geography, is that distance is going to mediate how we understand and experience and react to these type of questions, right? Distance is going to condition our anxieties. Distance is going to condition our perceptions about close and far away events. And distance is going to allow us to have different psychological or cognitive mechanisms that are going to activate perhaps some type of information, whether we're close to something, and some other type of information, whether it's political ideology or whatever it is, when we're far away, to help us understand a political phenomenon or whatever type of phenomena. So when we are close, right, when we're close to an event, we can verify it. We can see if, for example, the border with Mexico, it's a battleground. We can verify if the border with Mexico is being run over by, thousands and millions of migrants just running across the border. And when we're far away, we cannot have that luxury and verify what's going on. So that creates these different cognitive mechanisms that allow us to see something and interpret something in different ways. So when we're thinking about distance, right? The book theoretically is, I guess, anchored in a multidisciplinary set of literature. And basically the three I guess, main aspects of that is that a place is a unique spot in the universe, right? And that uniqueness refers to the geographic location of a place that is going to allow us or not to distinguish between near and far places. And that is going to be the here and now versus something that is completely far away. So if we are in a unique spot in the universe, whether we're in Houston or in Phoenix or any other place in the world, we're going to have a different set of contextual variables that are going to shape how we understand something. Second, place has physicality, and that means that place has stuff. And that stuff is going to be the composition and the interaction of things or objects or social relations that collide together in this unique spot in the universe. Whether we live in an urban area or rural area or whatnot, that stuff is going to be completely different, and that stuff is going to condition, right, how we understand that unique spot in the universe. And third one is that a place has this historical and social construction. So places are going to be imagined, places are going to be felt, places are going to be understood, and their meanings are going to be transmitted across time. So that has also implications in terms of how we start thinking about these number of issues. And that has to create a relative sense of how the location or the social phenomenon, their consequences, so on and so forth, is going to create a perceptive separation between the self, that is between myself, and remote places. And that cognitive separation has implications for how we, I guess, to plant verifiable information with different mechanisms. So the first of these two mechanisms is that being close to something or someone versus far away creates direct contact, right? And that direct contact reduces prejudice, and that direct contact allows to have trust under certain conditions that allows us to understand the place simply empirically by observing a particular phenomenon. Second, distance is going to moderate how we process information, how we understand a particular place, how we understand a particular object, a particular event or policy, and how we arrive at a specific a conclusion or opinion. So when we are close to a particular something or someone or an event or a policy, we experience that innate reality, right? And the context through that, through contact without any perceived separation. When we're far away, that perceived separation increases, and it has to be filled with something, right? It has to be filled whether with information that is based on a partisan note, with ideology. It has to be based with information that we get from the media or whatnot. But that bucket doesn't remain empty. It's not going to be one way or the other, as Salar said, that we're going to be a blank space in terms of our opinion. That opinion is going to draw from somewhere in order to come up with an interesting explanation. So what I'm trying to do in this research is to show how distance affects how we behave on the one hand, our opinions in terms of number of issues. In this book, I'm researching, for example, how our opinion about pandemics change whether we are close or far away, how it changed, for example, our mobility patterns, how we understand fear one way or another, I'm also researching how we react to social protests, whether we are close or whether we are far away, whether we are from one race, from another race, from this ethnicity, another ethnicity. I'm researching how people react to the border wall, how people react to climate change depending on where they're located, et cetera, et cetera. So today, what I want to show you is just some of the examples that I have done so far in terms of how it's conditioning how we understand a particular phenomenon. So the first thing that I want to talk about is about pandemics. And pandemics, as you know, are the perfect storm in the sense that they sell a lot, right? In terms of how media react to it. And also the pandemic also creates a significant fear. As we know, just think about how we were in March of 2020, when the coronavirus was here, everyone was going sent back home, and everyone had this collective fear about this particular virus. We are in 2022, we still have the virus around, but nowadays no one cares about it, right? It's something that we have learned to deal with it, and we have learned to deal with it not only because now we have vaccines, some treatments and so on and so forth, but because we are now close to it and we understand to a certain extent what are the risks, or we can control some of our anxieties and some of our emotions. So I started this journey with Zika, right? And Zika was a very interesting phenomena that happened in 2014, 2015, and 2016. Zika is a mosquito-borne virus that is going to create, especially among women and women that are pregnant, is going to affect the fetus and is going to create certain brain disorders and create some complications for the fetus. So in 2015, we had, I'm sorry, let me go back. In 2016, around April, we had a very powerful editorial in the New York Times from one of the most renowned epidemiologists in the nation, and he was, sounding the alarm. And the title of that editorial was called "Zika is Coming." And he starts the editorial, his op-ed saying, if I was a woman living in in Texas, in Houston, in New Orleans, et cetera, I would be very worried. And basically because he was talking about Zika is coming, we don't have a vaccine, and it can have very important implications for public health. So in 2015, there were around 141 news articles in terms of Zika. And Google Trends, the term Zika, or the word Zika, was around 37 out of 100. Zika in 2015 was not already here. Zika arrived in the US around 2016, when it was brought up through traveling patterns, and particularly brought up from Brazil. There was a lot of talk in terms of the Olympics back then in 2016, if some athletes were going to go, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So by 2016, the number of articles that we had about Zika went to 32,000. So 141 in 2015 to more than 32,000 articles in 2016. And Google Trends jumped to 48 from 37. So I got 2 surveys from the Kaiser Family Foundation, and I got the February and the June polls, tracking polls that track around 1,200 adults around the country. And thank God, to the Kaiser Family Foundation and to those researchers, they asked the same questions over and over in terms of Zika. And the question about Zika was if they felt more worried about Zika as the number of infections increased. So once again, here the question is about the physicality of the place of the stuff, and the place historical and social construction. So what I did with that data was simply trying to ascertain the distance, not the physical distance in terms of geography, but the psychological distance in terms of being bombarded by a number of media presence throughout 2016 in comparison to 2015. So in June, what I did was to map out, right, the fear of Zika amongst these survey respondents. So these maps show the number of individuals, right, that were very, very, I guess, worried in February of 2016. And as you can see, you have certain worriness or significant worriness in Los Angeles, obviously in the Northeast, Chicago, Miami, Houston, Atlanta, etc., right? But the rest of the country was finally, getting worried, but not something that you should be very worried about. Going back forward to June 2016, on your right-hand side, you can see that number, right, or the map suddenly lights up, right? And it lights up in terms of seeing, for example, yes, the similar cities in the Northeast lighted up, but then we start seeing around Detroit, around Chicago, Atlanta, Florida, North Florida, Miami, Houston, Dallas, Los Angeles, now San Francisco, lighting up, right? So between February to June 16, something happened, right? And people start to worry significantly about getting infected by Zika. Obviously, right, those numbers were higher in those places where mosquitoes are significant or have a significant presence, like, for example, in South Texas, obviously South Florida, etc., in areas that have these tropical climates. So it didn't make sense, right, to see, for example, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., etc. So part of the research question said, well, why people get worried, right? Why people are getting worried about Zika if, it's not going to happen. I mean, it's not going to happen to them, especially if, they're living in a place where there is not significant chances of getting infected. So what I did was running what we do normally, right? A simple regression, and a simple regression just regressing how worried you are about getting infected by Zika, not at all, not to worry, somewhat very worried. And then controlling for haven't heard anything about the virus, sex, ethnicity, education, income, self-identify, and if they self-identify as Republicans. And then I regress that on places that have low levels of Zika, high levels of Zika, and medium levels of Zika, coming the data from the RBOR database from the CDC that classified that, I guess, infection rate amongst the public. So when I run these results for February, nothing, no significance. The number of cases of Zika were completely irrelevant to try to predict the worriness about Zika. But then, right, in June, you see that those levels of getting infection, once Zika arrived to the US, once those number of cases are starting to increase, you see that there is a statistical relationship between the fear, right, or explaining the fear of Zika, given, right, the levels of infection at the county level. So once again, is this notion that distance, not perhaps in terms of geographic distance, but in terms of psychological distance, right? having the anxiety or having the manifestation of the fear, as they say, clear and present fear or danger at the doorsteps changes the perception of people, even though, right, it was not very significant to get infected. So anxiety and fear are going to be emotions that come to our mind when we're trying to understand how people feel about, a pandemic, Zika, Ebola, the coronavirus, et cetera, et cetera. And anxiety and fear arise because of the anticipation of these negative consequences of a threat, right? And this is going to be simply a cognitive appraisal. Anxiety, or what we feel, is going to be this pre-stimulus emotion, while fear is going to be that post-stimulus emotion. So think about, when we think about pandemics, think about, if you go to a safari, right, or if you're in the middle of the desert, and perhaps, you see a lion, right? And it's different to see a lion when you're seeing it, with binoculars, perhaps 1 mile away, than when you see the lion right in your face, right? So that creates a different psychological phenomenon, and that is that distance, right? That perception that we have, of that perceptive separation that we have with a fear, with something negative, how we change and how we calibrate our feelings and our fears or anxieties about these things. This notion of anxiety, this notion of fear and distance, is nothing that is, entirely new. It is Aristotle's talk about this notion of fear in the rhetoric. St. Thomas Aquinas also talk about fear. Dante Alighieri talks about fear and distance of perceiving, for example, demons coming, and how it changes the perception of individuals. The next example takes a different, a different notion, or a different take in terms of distance. And then I moved to Ebola. So Ebola was present in West Africa since 2013, at the end of 2013. By 2014, West Africa was already in pandemic stage, having infections crossing national borders, especially in all West Africa. So by 2014, it was a mess, right? It was already a mess at the beginning of the year. In the United States, the number, or the Google trends in terms of knowing about Ebola, was completely gone, right? It was simply not present whatsoever. Ebola arrives in the US in October of 2014. A traveler coming from West Africa to Dallas, Texas, was infected, and suddenly everything starts to go south. In Texas, between September and October, there were just around 318 news stories. And at the national level, between September and October, there were 15,000 news stories about Ebola. Just to give you a little bit of context of how likely it is for us to get infected by Ebola at that time, it was more likely to get killed by a thunder than getting infected with Ebola. So the odds of getting infected with Ebola back then in 2014 was 1 in 13.3 million. So it was zero, nothing. It was particularly nothing. It was not going to happen, right? However, we created all this anticipation of Ebola. We created all these issues about Ebola that were very hard to explain, because if we go ask people, how afraid are you that you're going to be struck by lightning, right? People are going to say zero. I don't even think about it. But when you ask in that time, how afraid are you going to be to get infected by Ebola, people would say very, very, very worried. So here what I'm showing is, right, how the articles of Ebola interact with the fear of getting infected by Ebola. And again, here, right, is how the media and those numbers of articles or how exposed we are to a certain story is going to bring perhaps the story back home one way or another, especially when we're focusing on local media. So this map shows the circles are going to be the number of articles about Ebola in a particular town, and these are local news articles. And the shade from sparse to dense is just going to be, once again, a map showing the concentration of people that were quite significantly worried about Ebola. So we see an interesting relationship, right? We see, for example, here in the cutouts, we see that the circle in terms of Washington, D.C. is significantly high. We see New York also very, very, very high. We also see in Dallas, the coverage of news articles quite significant. Houston, Los Angeles, San Francisco, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we see, right, significant, perhaps, right, some interaction or some indication that something is going on. So in this case, what I did was just basically wanted to ask, what is the probability of that you are going to be worried about getting infected, given the number of articles that are published in a particular location where you're living, your age, your education, your income, and your race and ethnicity. So when we think about that probability, when the articles are at the minimum, just one simple article, the probability of being worried about getting infected was around 0.53. When we go to the max, that was 200 and change number of articles in a particular locality, the probability increases to 0.76. Perhaps not a huge change in terms of the probability, but it's a 43% increase, right? And if you tell me that there is a 43 chance increase that I'm going to win the lottery, I will buy a lot of tickets, right? It's a huge jump in terms of how people perceptions change when you are confronted with that perhaps distance that is at the local level. This is not social media. This is not TV. These are local news artists, right, that are getting to the local community. So what happens in Dallas is not being distributed in New York or anything like that. It's just bringing that issue very locally to home. My next example is obviously COVID-19, right? And in this one, I just ask, how did partisanship affect our mobility during the first year of the pandemic, right? Given the phase of cumulative fatalities due to COVID-19. So here in the case is asking whether having death, right at our doorsteps, right, change our mobility behaviors one way or another. So in order to answer the question, I took Google's mobility trend that ascertains or measures, right, how people move or visited places such as groceries and pharmacies, how people visited places in terms of retail and recreation, and places of work. And then I took the 2020 county level presidential elections, and all these measures are at the county level, the county level presidential elections, and estimated the margin of victory, basically, Biden minus Trump votes divided by the total votes, to see if there was any difference between, right, how competitive those races were and how Republican or Democrat those places were. So I took the countries or the counties that were, the most pro-Trump counties, and that was Blount, Alabama versus Prince George's, Maryland, and Tarrant County, where there was a quite competitive race between Biden and Trump. And if you note here, basically plotting mobility across time for these two particular counties, three counties, and in terms of regarding mobility, grocery, and pharmacy. So you can see just by visually inspecting these, right, that mobility in Blount, Alabama was a little bit higher than the mobility in Prince George's, right? You have more movement in Blount, Alabama than Prince George's, Maryland, and also a little bit more than what you had in Tarrant County here in Texas. So looking at these graphs, I said, well, okay, there's something interesting going on here in terms of how these things change, right? How these things change the political or our mobility preferences at the county level, given that a county voted one way or the other. So once again, I did a regression interacting the number of cumulative deceased people because of COVID, and interacted with the percent lead in terms of our margin of victory. And what I found was very interesting patterns, right? The first one is when I regress or use as a dependent variable the grocery and pharmacy movements, I found that, you know, all of these were significant and the interaction were negative, but the only one that had a different sign was grocery and pharmacy. And to me, that kind of makes sense because, you know, these places were the places where you had to go, right? You had to go to the grocery and you had to go to the pharmacy, regardless of, you know, the stay-at-home orders or regardless of anything like that. So that's basic necessity. But what happens here is interesting in terms of retail and recreation and workplaces. And in these regressions, I'm talking about all the counties in the United States, right? Well, at least those that reported the electoral results and those that reported number of cumulative deaths. So here we see that as the number, right, of cumulative deaths increased, while the percent lead decreases, that is, once Trump got a significant advantage, right, the movement of people, right, tended to decrease. That is, that the mobility was significantly higher in other places, and the same for workplaces. So once again, is something that I'm exploring here. I have to do a different kind of modeling here, just basically a multi-level model, but this is just the initial idea that something is going on that can be explained given the interaction of partisanship and how that conditions our behavior when we interacted with the number of deaths that we're experiencing with our partisan ideology. So moving to a very different topic is about vote centers. In 2015, the Texas legislature passed a law saying that allow counties to have vote centers rather than precinct level voting. And a vote center means that they put different places where people can go and vote, regardless of where they live, as long as they're residents of a particular county. Obviously, these type of reforms and this type of movements have impact across communities and impact across electoral cycles. So the question that we were interested in answering in this particular project is, do vote centers increase turnout? That is, when you change precinct level voting, right? That is perhaps in your neighborhood or very close home, and now that has disappeared, and now it's moved to a different place, right? does that makes you more or less likely to go out and vote? So we did a bunch of different analysis for these particular election cycles. So what you're seeing here is the high and cold values that are clustered spatially. The hot red are going to be high values where you see a significant concentration. And then the red cycles, basically, or the dots, or the red things that you see on the screen, is where there is a high concentration of Hispanic voters, and the blue circles or the blue dots indicate a high concentration of non-Hispanic registered voters. The gray circles just indicate that there is no significant concentration of either white or Hispanic, I should say, non-Hispanic and Hispanic voters. The green push pins that you see in the map indicate the location of vote centers as of the last election cycle, and the black triangles indicate the position of precinct level voting locations before they transition to a vote center location. So push pins and triangles that are overimposed indicate that there was no significant change between vote centers and precinct level locations. In contrast, having single triangles indicate that precinct level locations that disappear in the latest electoral cycle, while lone push pins indicate a new voter location for the last particular elections. So what we see in this particular map, especially here in Travis County, and Travis County is the area of Austin, Texas, a very progressive Democratic area, shows that areas of high Hispanic registered voters, on average, they maintain the same number of vote centers before the transition. But in some areas of Travis County, more vote centers were included in high concentrations areas where Hispanics were residing, right? So it's just to see, for example, these areas that have new vote centers, but overall they were not significantly touched. The same thing happens here for McLennan County. And in McLennan County, we see that in high areas of Hispanic registered voters concentration by McLennan County, we see that around 10%, 10 precinct level locations in 2010 disappear in 2014. So you see new vote centers that are very geographically concentrated, while in some other areas, these vote centers are not going to be present in these particular county. For Parker County, that is also a rural county, we see that in areas of high Hispanic registered voter concentration in this particular county, we see that the number of vote centers did not increase nor decrease in comparison to the previous election cycle. The location of vote centers remain outside high concentration of Hispanic areas. The same thing happens for Bend County outside the city of Houston. And once again, it remained unchanged in the comparison with different voters. But what we found in this particular research is quite interesting. So the impact of vote centers, and that is the driving distance from your place of residence to a vote center, as the distance increases, right, the probability for Latinos to go out and vote decreases. While for non-Hispanics, right, it doesn't really matter. And it has to do with how these vote centers are located. So this, at least in Texas, is a new variable that we have to take into consideration when we're thinking about turnout, right? And that is the driving distance between where we live, right, and the availability of a vote center. The other part of this book project is about, obviously, the border wall, right? And it's how to see or how to ascertain the interaction between proximity and partisanship. So methodologically speaking, in this paper, I also take into consideration the differences between driving distance, right? And the differences between, and the difference that it has with Euclidean distance, right? As the crow flies, the normal distance that a lot of people use. So what I did, as I did in the previous examples, is I geocode every single participant in a national survey, and then I estimate the driving distance from their location where they reside to the closest border crossing point that are shown in these particular amount. So having that distance, then I estimate, I take the log of the distance. That's normal procedure in spatial statistics. And then I estimate the attitudes towards the border wall, given if the individual self-identifies as a Republican, non-native born versus foreign-born Hispanics, race, income, education, female age, percent of the Mexican population living in a particular individual zip code, crime, religious attendance, Trump approval, and if the wall is going to be effective or not in stopping immigration. So these two graphs shows the probability of supporting the wall given distance in miles, both for driving distance and for the Euclidean distance. And basically, we don't see significant changes in terms of that. But what is very interesting is to see that increasing the distance, right, from the border to for a Republican living, 20-fold increase. That's around, let's say 100 miles from the border. The probability of a Republican favoring the odds of a Republican favoring the wall increases by around 4 times. And the probability, for example, the odds of a Republican living in RSU County, that was the farthest point that I have in this data, versus a Republican living in Yuma, Arizona, that is the closest point that I have to the border of a person that resides closer to the border, was 19, almost 20 times, right? So in this case, as distance increases, right, from the border, a Republican is going to be more likely to support the construction of the border wall. And once again, is that mechanism of supplanting information with previously acquired information that could be or not be biased or ideological or whatnot. So just to finalize and open the discussion is, first of all, distance matters, right? Even in a 24/7 social media, 24/7 news world, distance still matters. Geography still matters. How we think about a phenomenon, how we think about political actions, how we think about pandemics, how we think about everything. Distance matters. And it matters because it's going to condition how we understand a particular phenomena given direct contact and the supply and amount of information that is going to shape individual constructs, right? And that is the number of articles, our ideological predispositions in terms of political identity or ideological positions, just in terms of left and right. And also, distance is a necessary condition for us to facilitate contact. And contact allows us to understand something or someone through a very particular lens of a particular perspective. And also distance, right? As we increase distance, our theory, my theory, is that increases, right, the amount of and kind of direct information that is not going to be available to us. And thus we have to rely on different sources in order to understand a particular phenomenon. So this is all I have. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will be more than happy to start conversation, whatever you want. So thank you very much.
Terrific. All right, thank you. So I've invited our audience to add questions into the chat as we sort of wait for folks to populate anything that's in there. Let me just open it up to any of the panelists here. Rodney, do you have any questions? Xenia, do you have anything that you would like to ask?
Yeah, how do you sort out the physical distance from the social media access dimension? Jeronimo, if I I don't know if that question makes sense, but it is the case, presumably, that people in certain physical places have more or less information access to certain kinds of information. And somebody that's 20 miles away, there's other sources of social media, and their distance from what would be another question. You use several of examples, one like the voter centers and so on. But how is that affected by also of access to civic centers or places of community interaction and so on? Because both those concepts, the social media, are vast and large, and so is social physical distance to what? Again, you can specify voting, but that's a one-time. Well, even now, people might vote not via physically going to a vote center. They may just mail it in, which is more or less difficult or easy depending on where one lives. So how do you begin to sort out all that complexity?
Right. So let me start closest to what. So it's going to vary, right, depending on the case. In the case of vote centers, it's to the closest vote center that they have. It's a matter of knowing or just estimating the driving distance, right? And just from where they're registered to vote and the closest voting center. Obviously, that could have important implications, because it doesn't show, or it's not necessarily where that voter actually voted, right? Could have voters, I don't know, somewhere else, right? But it's just a proxy of distance, and it's a proxy basically on the location of these vote centers, right? In terms of in communities, especially Latino communities, if there is more tendency to have vote centers in terms of density, or if you observe more vote centers, right, in other places where Hispanics are not the biggest chunk of the electorate. So in order to see, we're not making any significant assumptions in terms if there is any political socialization process before or after, right? I mean, I see what you're saying in terms of having a civic center, or having, for example, a GOTV campaign, or if someone took you to the polls, et cetera, et cetera. I think that can have significant implications. So what I'm doing is just basically seeing if distance has, and using the traditional predictors that we have of voting, right? Income, education, age, attendance to religious religious services, so on and so forth, right? Just using those traditional and adding a new variable and say, well, does driving really affects or doesn't affect? This is only done, at least, well, not only done, this is only done for Texas. We have very restrictive laws in terms of who can vote by mail. And in this particular data set, we only use those individuals that voted in person. We didn't take into account those individuals that voted by mail, which is deleted them from the database. In terms of social media, we don't have the content, right? And that's something that I've always wanted to do in terms of trying to measure what people are actually reading, right? but we don't have, the only thing that we have is if they use social media or not. But unfortunately, we don't have, or I don't have data that would allow me to see, exactly what is exactly what they're doing in terms of social media that can bias information. I guess proxy or the theoretical jump that we're doing is, based on political ideology and based on partisanship. If you're a Republican, well, most likely or than not, you're not watching MSNBC, right? You're getting your news by these, forums or media outlets that tend to be in line with your own political biases. And, there's ample literature that has shown, the polarization in media consumption as well. So we're just using that as a proxy, perhaps. It's not the cleanest way, but it's the only data that we have so far.
I just want to be sensitive to some time. I thought it might be useful for me to ask some of the questions that we have in the queue before you respond, so you can collect as much as you can. And we've also recorded this, so we'll be able to pass the link to you. Let me start in the Q&A. In the first question in the queue is from Professor Narayani La Sala Blanco, and she, of course, is familiar with your work and is a big fan. And she wanted you to expand. Oh, Nara, would you like to ask it yourself? You're on.
No, I thought you promoted me to panelist because my question was confusing. I'm happy to ask it directly.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so Jeronimo, I was thinking, I really liked this paper, and I understand it's a book project. And so it got me thinking about the psychological distance. And if I understand it correctly, this is sort of like how much bombardment you get from the media, as opposed to the tension between that and the actual context you're in. And so I was thinking about the work you've done in terms of, income inequality in your immediate, in your local context, and how that influences how you vote. Mm-hmm. So if you live in a place of high inequality, and you are, that is sort of it makes you sensitive to issues about inequality, or I would expect that to inform your political behavior. But then what if you're bombarded with other questions that sort of, erase, my question is, can the psychological distance erase issues that you refer to as, geographic distance? So you are close to the border, as you were saying. However, you are bombarded by on social media, or even on the normal media, on issues that tell you things that are different from your reality. So right. How does that work, and how do they interact, this psychological distance to the actual distance? That's my question.
Right. So I guess psychological distance, you can also see it in terms of time, right? Like, for example, the case of Ebola or the case of Zika, right? Zika was here, Ebola was here, right? Well, in the world, in West Africa, right? So on the one hand, you have the geographic distance, us versus, or the Western world versus West Africa, right? That you see it very far away, very far removed from how you conceive your worldview, right? They're far away. Even though they may be close, they're going to be far away. So that's one. The other one is the aspect of time, right? You're bringing time to a different dimension, and you're understanding time as something that doesn't produce any anxiety or anything like that, right? For our cases, think about, 3 months ago, I was not anxious about this book, right? Because I said, like, well, I still have time, right, to finish it. Now I look at the watch and I'm in November, right? So that distance is closing. So the same thing happens with Zika, the same thing happens with the pandemics and everything. We tend to push it because we don't see those negative consequences being immediate, right? And we tend to focus on a particular aspect. The point that you make in terms of social media is very important, because as you are more far away, right, from the border, in this case, or from something else, you have to put stuff in the bucket, right? You have to understand that thing that is happening in the border one way or the other. And even in here, I mean, you guys, I'm sure that you see in the border, but here in Texas, you see it. Even here in, you know, San Antonio, right? That it's a couple of 100 miles away from the border. You understand that there is a very different reality, what happens at the border and what happens, you know, in you know, Houston or San Antonio, whatnot. The same thing that you can understand between you know, the Latinos voting for Trump in the Rio Grande Valley. That is, yes, it went up, of course, but it's this big of chunk of the electorate, right? It's 4% or less than 4% of the electorate, right? So the reality is a completely different reality. And that distance is in time, that distance is in geography, and that distance is also in terms of the negative consequences that you can anticipate of something being close or far away from you.
Let me read off some questions. The next one in the Q&A, and then I'll ask two that were on my mind. So the next one in the queue from the Q&A is from Professor Fabian Neuner, and he wants to know about, we often think about nationalized media environments and the nationalization of politics. And he asks Jeronimo, is there important variation in the extent to which an issue is nationalized and how much distance matters? So keep that one in your pocket. And then the question that I have, two of them, is one is, can you tell us what's the difference, or how do we distinguish between psychological distance and issue salience, which is the sort of concept and term that is out there in the existing. And then the other question I have is, your talk was location, location, location. That was the title. And I need some help here telling me, how does location inform your interpretation? Help me understand, for instance, how location mattered to some of your key findings. The February to June 2016 comparison on Zika, or the probability that you would worry about Ebola infection. I saw location there sort of was conceptualized or operationalized as psychological distance or attention in the case of Zika. In the case of Ebola, it was the number of articles that appeared on Ebola. And then in the COVID-19 mobility, I saw that like location was sort of understood to mean as partisanship. And I guess I'm asking that because I want to understand, there's different ways to think about location, and you use it sort of like psychological distance, variation in number of articles. But I thought what you were saying was that location was going to be a way to take the Ebola analysis, that you would bin places by the number of articles, let's say, that and so you would have similar number of articles, and within those bins you could distinguish, say, Dallas from Chicago, or Seattle from Omaha, Nebraska. They had the same level of articles, but they're in different locations, right? And that the location was going to be what was driving the difference you observe. Yeah. So you start with Fabian's and then circle back.
Okay, with Fabian's question is, yes, absolutely. I guess that this book is kind of a response to, you know, the nationalization of politics, and the idea that, yes, they're going to be nationalized. And I think that has very important implications, in the sense that if it's a national issue like the border wall or immigration or something like that, then the likelihood that someone knows in Wisconsin what's going on, right, is going to increase rather than if you're comparing, for example, Harvey or the memorial flood that we had here in Houston, for instance, right? And that has implications for that. So I think that, you know, the difference is that is going to, as Francisco was saying, is going to increase the salience of a particular issue, and that perhaps is going to have a different interaction with other background variables in terms of trying to understand how that shapes. For this notion, right, of the nationalization of politics, I think that that is related once again with what Francisco is saying between issue saliency and how important it is. However, I still think that the distance to that particular phenomenon where it's happening is going to have significant variation between being close or far away. And that is the notion, for example, in the case of the border wall, right? You're going to have that significant impact at the border, even, control for all the stuff that I control, you're going to have that significant impact in comparison where you're going to be far away. And I think that that's the psychological distance, aka geographic distance, that is filled with other stuff in order for you to make sense of that particular phenomenon. And I know that I'm rambling, but about this, but it's perhaps something that I have to be clear in the book. And I'm trying to go back to chapter 1 about some, I guess, things that I need to change. The other thing, Francisco, when you say location, well, the first lesson that I get is that perhaps I need to pick my titles better for my presentations. But no, I think I see what you have, and it's the way that I conceptualize distance, right, in this book is, one is the physical distance between A and B, right? That's the geographic distance. Then we have the psychological distance, right? And that can be given or brought up or created through being exposed to one point to another. Fortunately, I take very well what you say in terms of being, Omaha, Nebraska versus Dallas, Texas, et cetera, within the same being. Are there any differences? I don't have enough data to make such inferences at that level because of the nature of the sample. But I can definitely, that's something that I can further explore a little bit more, and that's a good point that is I think gonna help me, and also help me to think about being perhaps more clear in bullet points, like this is 1, this is 2, this is 3, in terms of how I conceptualize distance. And that's a very good point that I need to really increase to make it clear in not only my presentation, but also in the book manuscripts. So thank you for both, for Fabian's and your questions.
Great. Other questions you want to add to the Q&A, or would anybody like to be elevated to panelists? Oh, Narayani's got her hand up, so please unmute.
Hi, you can hear me, right? Okay.
Yes.
I just want to say, just a comment. I think even if politics are being nationalized, I agree with your argument, Jeronimo, that direct experience, there's something about the place that still matters, because it's the cumulative experience of living in that place. So you could say, or I would say, it's also part of your political socialization. Therefore, it's part of your deep held beliefs. So it almost acts like as a filter in which you still take in national politics. So I love your title. Of course, I also like studying the local context, but I think that even if they're, the person in Wisconsin or the person wherever the person is, they're getting bombarded and there's less psychological distance, I guess I would say. There's still something about the place and the cumulative effect of perceiving politics from that place that still matters and might override what you see or hear. Yeah.
No, I agree with you. It's perhaps, I guess the issues are being able to articulate these things, because we're not trained, right? As political scientists, we're not trained. We always control for space, right? We always control for county, and we put, an indicator variable and rural county and urban county, and that's it. But we never go very deep in terms of other dynamics, unless you're doing a study about a particular county, right? But in terms of quantifying that, in terms of trying to measure those differences in distance and those differences in terms of context and how you take place as a very serious variable, is something that at least I was not taught to do that. Besides just put an indicator variable and you're done with it, right? So it's trying to something that I'm trying to, I guess, measure, and one of the measurements, or I guess one of the things I'm trying to do is to use this concept of distance, whether geographic, psychological, or whatnot.
So I want to two-finger doesn't respond to, but I think part of what bothers me, or that I found provocative about what you're saying, but leaves me asking more questions, is that you pivot from location, 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 and reminding us that place has stuff in it, to saying with the thing that's driving my analysis is going to be the distance of that place to something else. So it's now the stuff that's driving it is measured in terms of Euclidean space, right? It's like, here's the physical distance from here to this. And sometimes you say psychological distance, which to me sounded a lot like salience.
Okay.
Right?
I see what you're saying.
The place, I think I hear what you're saying. And when you say the things like place, let's remember place is made up of stuff. That seems like you could really interrogate that a little bit more. What is the stuff that distinguishes Dallas from Houston,
right,
from El Paso? There's something about that location that I don't know, maybe it's the built environment, maybe it's the sort of the I mean, there's arguments, right, in political science that talk about the importance of geological and geographical space. Like there's behaviors that are associated with mountainous terrain versus plain and flatland. And so it's kind of going in that direction. It feels like that there's the stuff that makes up the places that distinguishes it. But I didn't.
Yeah, no, I see. Yeah. I understand what, I mean, yes, I mean, I agree. And it's a matter of, I guess, yeah, I mean, I have to think further, but I see where you're going, and it's 100% valid comment and concern. And it's better for me to, acknowledge it right now and solve it right now after sending it to the reviewers for their final approval, because I don't want to have 11,000 comments on that. So thank you very much. That is super useful. So thank you very much for that. I'm just trying to put a note.
So I wanted to thank everybody for joining us. Jeronimo, if you could stay on, I'm going to see if there's any grad students that wanted to talk to you in a small group setting.
Sure.
Everybody else, thank you for joining us. If you're a grad student and wanted to get an opportunity to talk to Jeronimo, please raise your hand and I'll go ahead and move you to panelists so you can join us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Francisco. Thank you, Nara.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank
Thank you,
everyone for
Courtney.
being on.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. Very